Hello everybody, welcome to semester 2 of biology. We're going to begin semester 2 with a study of the cell, focusing on things like the membrane and cell division. In middle school, you probably learned a lot about organelles such as the nucleus, possibly the cytoplasm, things like that. So we won't focus on those things that you've probably already learned about. So let's get into it. In your CK12 assignments this week, you have 3 sections. Sections 2.1, parts of a cell, 2.2, prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and then section 2.3, the phospholipid bilayer. And basically what I'm going to do here in this video is I'm going to try to highlight the important things as you read through these sections and add a little bit of my knowledge to the mix as well. So let's start by taking a look at a picture of a cell. Maybe you know what kind of cells these are, probably given away by the red appearance. These are human red blood cells. One of the characteristic features of red blood cells are these little indentations that you see here. That's sort of the giveaway. It sort of looks like a belly button to me. Anyways, as you begin your study of cells, um, the reading talks about, who was the first person to discover a cell, um, and who was the first person to discover bacteria and things like that. One of the takeaways from this section is going to be something called the cell theory. And typically a guy named Robert Hooke is given credit for the discovery of that theory, mainly because he was the first guy to actually view cells under a microscope. And so he's a very famous guy, mainly because he took a chunk of cork and sliced it into a really thin slice, put it under the microscope, and noticed all these little repeating units. And he called them cells because they looked like the cells that a prisoner might be in. And so these were just plant cells that he was observing, and that's something we can see in our laboratory in class. And so Robert Hooke discovers the cell, and his theory says that all life is composed of cells. And so it sort of depends on what your definition of life is, but as far as we know, all living things are composed of cells. Now is a, sort of a gray area with something called a virus. So a virus, some people consider to be living, and other scientists might argue that viruses are not living. And viruses are not composed of cells, and that's sort of why they're not considered living. But maybe they should be, or maybe we should revise cell theory. But it's been around for so long, that's one of the big reasons why we don't consider viruses to be alive. Viruses are just really simple chunk of DNA and RNA, and then with a little protein coat. So they don't have the complex structures that we see in animal and plant cells, and even bacterial cells. So the next guy I want to talk about is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Leeuwenhoek built off of Robert Hooke's work, and he was the first guy to discover human blood cells. And also one of the gross stories about Leeuwenhoek was how he looked at the plaque from his own teeth and observed it under the microscope. So he actually scraped his teeth and was looking at that stuff. And that's how he first discovered bacteria. He could actually see moving things in the scrapings of his teeth. Pretty disgusting. That's why you should all brush your teeth. And one other thing that you should probably know is what Leeuwenhoek actually called the bacteria. So before there was even the word bacteria, he called them little animalcules, which means tiny animals. So those are probably the two guys that you need to know about, Robert Hooke and Anton van Leeuwenhoek in the discovery of cells. And then getting back to cell theory, what is a theory? Remembering that from the beginning of the year, we're trying to explain something, we're trying to base it off observable evidence, and it needs to be falsifiable. And so we're explaining that all life is composed of cells. It's basically what we observe, and everything that's alive is composed of cells as far as we know. And it's certainly falsifiable because maybe someday we'll find some strange life in the universe that is not composed of cells, and then we would need to revise the cell theory. So there's a lot of different kinds of cells out there. This graphic shows some of the more interesting ones. I think one of the coolest are nerve cells. And nerve cells have these really characteristic dendritic network that sort of looks like the branches of a tree as the nerve cells spread out. And that's what allows you to feel and sense things. We have red blood cells right here, like we talked about earlier. Here's a picture of bacteria. Now, bacteria are a heck of a lot smaller than, let's say, the cells of a cork that like Hooke saw. To be able to view bacteria, we would need to look through at least 100 power magnification on our microscopes. And then we have some algae cells and then some pollen grains. And so one of the big ideas here is that the form of the cell, the sort of the shape of the cell, is going to be really closely related to the structure that that cell is designed for. And so if we look at this picture of a smooth muscle cell, the way muscle cells are designed, you can see the nucleus and the individual cell units, but they have these long sort of elongated appearance. And what that's for is the ability to contract. And what muscles do is as they contract, they have the ability to move body parts. And so we need to make the muscle cells kind of elongated to give them space to contract so they can perform their function. And similarly with neurons and nerve cells, like I said, we have this dendritic network to feel sensation, and then that neuron is connected by a long connector into another nerve cell, which can then be connected to another nerve cell, and ultimately it's going to make its way to your brain or your spinal cord. And so the shape of these neurons is really important for their function, which is to have sensation over every part of your body. Maybe you've heard of somebody who doesn't have sensation in maybe a limb or a finger or something like that, and that's because their nerve cells have been damaged. And one of the problems with nerve cells is they don't repair themselves as well as some of the other cell types like smooth muscle or skeletal muscle, or even bone cells are good at regrowing, but the nerve cells aren't so good at regenerating. So some of the common parts of a cell, we've got the plasma membrane, and we're going to really dig into this. We're going to do some studies with how membranes work because they're constructed with lipids. And we're going to look at processes called like fusion and osmosis. And second, most cells are going to have some sort of cytoplasm that's like the goo inside the cell. Ribosomes, where the proteins are made, and of course the DNA, which is in the nucleus. And so that's sort of just a basic overview of cells. And let's get into the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic next. So what we need to talk about next is the two major categories of cells. There's a lot of different types of cells like muscle, bone, nerve, those sorts of things. But those are all the same category of cells. Those are all either animal or plant cells, and both of those cell types are really fall into a category called eukaryotic cells. So when you're reading, it talks about two types of cells. I think a better way to say it might be two categories of cells. And the two categories are either prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells. And so eukaryotic cells I want to start with because those are the ones that we're most familiar with. And these are the cells that we're composed of. So these are cells that have a nucleus. That is really the big thing that separates eukaryotic cells from prokaryotic cells. So in a eukaryotic cell, we've got these things called organelles, which you've probably learned about before, and a nucleus, and we can have lots of different kinds, but they're all going to have a lot of these same structures. But the big idea is if there is a nucleus, you're going to be a eukaryotic cell. And if there's no nucleus, we're going to call you something called a prokaryotic cell. So prokaryotic cells are basically a simpler cell where the DNA is sort of just enclosed in a nuclear membrane, but there's no actual nucleus. And a lot of times you see prokaryotic cells for single-celled organisms like bacteria. And one of the things that's interesting about the prokaryotic cell is that it's the oldest type of cell. We think that eukaryotic cells evolved from prokaryotes, and the oldest forms of life that we've been able to detect on planet Earth have been prokaryotic organisms. So eukaryotes, prokaryotes, two big deals. Really, just one has a nucleus, one doesn't. One is simple, one is complex. Watch this video from the Amoeba Sisters. That's a good overview. And this one is probably optional, the second one. And so in summary, prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells do. Eukaryotic cells have organelles, and they're more complicated. So that was a pretty straightforward section, but also really important. So the last section you have to read this week is the section 2.3 on the phospholipid bilayer. And so the cell membrane, which is really the same thing as composed of the phospholipid bilayer, is something we are going to focus on. We want to know a lot about it because there's a lot of important things that happen with respect to cell transport that we're going to learn about. And so the first thing to do is to talk about the structure of the cell membrane. And so basically we have this internal environment on one side inside the cell, and then we have some external environment. And if you remember from earlier in the course, we talked about something called homeostasis. And that was where an organism has to maintain kind of stable conditions, temperature, pH, those sorts of things, in order to be healthy and survive. The same sort of thing goes on the microscopic level, and inside the cell we have to maintain homeostasis. Otherwise, the cell can die. Now, just because one cell died doesn't mean the entire organism died, but certainly you can sustain damage to certain cells. So, what does the membrane do? Well, first thing it does is it regulates what comes and goes in and out of the cell. And you can see these channels right here. These are really important protein channels that allow things to come in and go out. But first, I want to revisit the structure of this membrane. Take a look at these blue balls here with the little squiggly tails. That should look a heck of a lot like a lipid molecule that we talked about last week. Remember, a lipid molecule has a glycerol head and then fatty acid tails. The glycerol head was hydrophilic and the fatty acid tails were hydrophobic. And so we talked about how oils and fats, when you mix them in water, they have a tendency to form these spherical balls called micelles. And those were to sort of protect the tails from water. And that's because the tails are nonpolar and the heads are polar. So kind of revisiting some of these things we've already learned about. So it's called the lipid bilayer because it looks like a sandwich. There's a layer of lipids on one side, sort of protecting what comes into the cell. It's sort of this waterproof layer. And there's also a second layer on the inside of the cell to complete the lipid bilayer sandwich, I like to call it. And so basically it's this waterproof barrier that prevents stuff from coming in and going out, and only certain materials which are regulated by proteins can enter or exit. And one word that you want to focus in on as you read this section is this one called semi-permeability or selectively permeable. And that's what I was talking about, how sometimes certain things can come in and other things might not be able to come in. So what else? Hydrophilic, hydrophobic. I talked about that stuff. Ooh, nice picture here. So here's the bilayer sheet. What else can we look at here? Well, this is really the structure of the lipid molecule. Here's the glycerol head, and then here we have the fatty acid tails. And I like how this is showing this side is polar and this other side is going to be nonpolar. And it should make sense why it arranges like this to sort of protect the fatty acids from the water. So videos you should watch. That one's going to be an optional video, Science Friday, if you want to check it out. And I think that's cell membrane. You might want to watch this one on cell membranes and cell walls. But as we dig further in, we're going to be doing some experiments about things that can move across the cell membrane.